the events in China over the last few days. This is a milestone. This is a big event. This is a history in the making, if you like. Uh, but it is multi-layered, and it has, if you pardon my Hegelian roots, many contradictions wrapped up inside it. So, for example, it is a decline, not yet the end for sure, but a decline of the position of the United States. There seems to be no question in my mind that that is what's going on many levels as we speak. That phenomena, which we could talk about, coexists and interacts with an ongoing other process called the transition from capitalism to one or another kind of socialism, which I also think is going on inside and among the very same countries and movements that are engaged in the rise of the East and the decline of the West. It's not an either or, it's an intermingling. If you like, it's an uneven development of different social processes that go on at the same time. And for people like me, I see many positive, not altogether, but many positive consequences of what is happening with China, India, and all of that, Russia and so forth in the East. I think that is changing the world economy likely in an irreversible direction. I really do see it as the evolution of capitalism away from its center of origin, Britain, Europe, and so on, to become much more global, and in the process, not only to change its geography, but to change where is the dynamic growth center and where is the decline. And that is shifting as we speak. But again, I don't see that as a perspective that denies or refuses to see or undervalues class struggles, struggles between workers and employers, that has its logic and its foundation and has moved east along with everything else about capitalism over the last century and is not going away, is not going to disappear, may take different forms, may take different organizational arrangements. But I think our analysis needs to be focused on the interplay without necessarily cheering the one or regretting that the anti-colonial or the anti-American phase of this is dominant for a while. If I could say one more thing, it's like celebrating in the 20th century anti-colonialism. You could do that without being blind to the fact that bourgeoisies could emerge in the former colonial countries and become the power, become the dominant shaper of what's going on. That wouldn't mean that you denied or didn't see the different layers of all of this. And I can assure you, we are seeing here in the United States, and which may be shaping the very things I'm saying to you now, is that the desperate, and I mean the word desperate, the desperate efforts of the United States regime to hold on to the mythology of American dominance, to go to really extraordinary lengths now to maintain it. And I don't just mean a physical thing, changing the name of our Department of Defense, which was always a joke, back to the Department of War tells you something. The ability of the United States 3 days ago to shoot and kill 11 people in a boat 1,000 miles from the United States, a boat carrying who knows what, from where to where, none of it known. These are little events, yes, but they bespeak a struggle that's going on here that pretends it's in charge. And one last point, I'm living here speaking to you from Manhattan in downtown New York City. And I'm watching another aspect of all of this. A socialist Muslim young man is en route to becoming the mayor of New York City. This is also a part of a shift that is complicated, but is going on alongside of the Trump regime, which is what gets the publicity.
Professor Patnaik, your response.
Let me get to the point which Professor Wolf was raising about America's desperation. I think we have to go back a little into the context. You see, every leader of the capitalist world generally has to preside over a diffusion of capitalism. Britain presided over the diffusion of capitalism from Britain originally to Europe, to the United States, to Canada, Australia, and other regions of European settlement in the 19th century. Now, that diffusion was associated with an economic prosperity in Britain, the famous Victorian boom, Edwardian boom, and it was also associated with social stability. It was so partly because the current account deficits and the capital account deficits, which the leading country has to incur in vis-a-vis the areas to which capitalism is diffusing. Britain had to incur vis-a-vis continental Europe or vis-a-vis the United States, was something, that has to be done. Obviously, you have to keep your markets open and you have to make capital exports. But that was essentially, substantially met by the political drain from the colonies, politically imposed drain from the colonies, because of which actually Britain was not an indebted or a debtor country by the First World War. On the contrary, Britain had fairly strong balance of payments. It was really the world's largest capital exporter. It was not a debtor country. At the same time, you actually had migration taking place from Europe. According to Arthur Lewis, 50 million Europeans migrated in the long 19th century from Europe to the temperate regions of European settlement, which actually kept down the reserve army of labor, kept down the unemployment problem. And what is more, because they migrated to areas where you actually had land available and the Amerindians were driven off the land and so on. Therefore, it actually raised the reservation wage in Europe, in Britain, and so on. Therefore, the wages of the workers improved, unemployment declined, the reserve army was kept under control, and the balance of payments were not a serious problem. So you had economic prosperity together with a kind of social stability associated with the diffusion of capitalism in the leading country. But you look at the United States, just the opposite. Starting roughly from around 1980, when you actually had this process of globalization, diffusion of capitalism to East Asia, to China. By capitalism, I mean capitalist enterprises to China, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and so on, is something that is associated with a relocation that tends to keep down the real wages in the United States. It is not associated with any improvement vis-a-vis employment. On the contrary, unemployment and the reserve army in the US has increased. And at the same time, it is associated with a substantial increase in the overall US balance of payments current account deficit. So both in terms of, in fact, there are estimates, like for instance, that the average real wage of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. Now, that's a very serious thing to say, but therefore you actually have diffusion under American leadership giving rise to economic distress of the working people as well as social instability, while the opposite was the case with the earlier diffusion. I think it is this which, in a sense, gives rise to the kind of desperation that Professor Wolf was referring to. And this is why the US, all this tariff terrorism, all this business about, the threat to the dollar that this poses, potential threat, has to be warded off, because of which the US is really kind of, adopting all kinds of aggressive measures, because similarly, the aggression vis-a-vis Brazil for, the kind of measures that Brazil has been taking, coming closer to China, the aggression recently vis-a-vis India for using Russian oil, all these are really desperate measures in order to sustain a situation where you have, on the one hand, the demands for diffusion of capitalism, which is what capital wants, and at the same time, the economic distress and social instability that is generated. That contradiction is something which the US has not been able to overcome, and is desperate to overcome, at the expense of all kinds of countries of the third world.
Professor Wolf.
I could not agree more. And think about what that implies, right? You're not going to resolve these contradictions. Nicely summarized by Professor Patnaik, by heaving tariffs at India or by sinking boats off of Venezuela. What are you doing? It's one thing to be desperate within the framework of a strategy that might bring you something. But I find it extraordinary that I see desperation around me, but always with a dead end at the other side of it. I don't understand how. And so it leads us to the view, which is widespread here in the United States, that we have a president who has no strategy, who is so busy bouncing from one situation to another that you don't have the feeling there's some plan that might at least lead somewhere. And here's a couple of other things that come to my mind as I listen to Professor Patnaik. On the right in this country, which is stronger now than it has been for quite a while, the single most frequently heard word with which to denounce the enemies of the right wing is the word globalist. The enemy of our right wing are globalists. And those are, left-wingers are given that name. Big banks in New York are given that name. The bad businessmen and women who want to keep open trade with the East, these are all denounced as globalist. The whole notion, since they're right wing, the language of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism is not available to them. They either don't know it or they don't want to get near it. So they had to come up with globalism. So they understand the last 40 years, that summarized by that statistic about real wages having not only not gone up, but actually shrunken. For them, this is all the fault of a globalism, and they want the United States to reject globalism, to do everything to make the United States number one. So it becomes a strategy for the ennoblement, for the enlargement of the self-image of the United States, and that's it. And so punishing Putin or punishing Modi or punishing Xi Jinping or punishing anybody is a sign of the dominance of the United States. It is a kind of politics of theater that may always have been there, but strikes me these days as extraordinarily pronounced here.